In the dense forest, where the trees were thick and the ground soft with fallen leaves, there was a wildlife sanctuary tucked deep within the heart of nature. The sanctuary was a haven for a variety of animals. Elk wandered in herds, foxes slinked through the underbrush, and wild horses roamed free, their manes flowing in the wind like ghosts of the ancient. Among these horses was a chestnut stallion named Valor. His coat was a rich reddish-brown, almost glowing against the backdrop of the forest, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed to peer into the depths of anyone who looked at him. Valor was different from the others. He had an unnerving calm about him, a stillness that never seemed to break, even in the most chaotic of situations. He had been raised here in this sanctuary and had known only the freedom of the wild. He was as much a part of the forest as the trees, and the caretakers of the sanctuary had come to view him as a symbol of the sanctuary's success, strong, untamable, and wise beyond words. One afternoon, when the sky was still pale from the last of the morning fog, a visitor arrived at the sanctuary. His name was Daniel, and he had come to observe, to track the wild herds and photograph their behavior. He was quiet and unassuming, his boots crunching on the forest floor, his camera in hand as he made his way toward the stables where the horses were kept. The caretaker, an elderly woman named Agnes, noticed him from afar but didn't interrupt his movements. She had long since learned that the animals didn't like being observed too closely, and Daniel, though quiet, seemed to have a gentle demeanor. Agnes kept to the shadows, watching him as he wandered toward the fence where Valor stood alone. The stallion's gaze met Daniel's the moment he entered the field. It was a steady, unwavering look, and though it was impossible to read, it felt like Valor was sizing him up, studying him with a precision that made Daniel uneasy. But Daniel, professional as always, continued to walk closer, adjusting his camera to capture the light that played off Valor's coat. He took several pictures, the only sound the faint click of the camera shutter. As he stood there watching the horse, the breeze shifted, carrying with it a faint scent that Daniel couldn't place. It was sharp, almost metallic, like the smell of something decaying deep in the forest. He frowned and glanced around. The birds had gone silent. Even the rustle of leaves in the trees seemed to have quieted. The woods, which usually thrummed with life, felt empty, unnervingly so. And yet, Valor stood still, unblinking, his eyes still locked on Daniel. Daniel's unease grew, but he shook it off, adjusting the lens of his camera and continuing to snap pictures. But just as he moved closer, the air around him grew colder, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The horse, as if responding to some unseen force, turned its head slowly, looking into the depths of the forest behind him. There was no wind, yet the trees seemed to sway with an unnatural creak. Daniel stiffened, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. Valor snorted softly, a low rumble from deep within his chest, and without warning, the stallion bolted. But instead of running away as Daniel had expected, Valor galloped toward the thickest part of the forest, disappearing into the trees with an urgency that sent ripples through the underbrush. Daniel hesitated, the noise of the stallion's hooves fading as he pondered whether to follow. Agnes had warned him many times to leave the wild horses to their own devices, but something about this felt different. He moved quickly, deciding to follow the trail of disturbed leaves and broken branches. His heart pounded with an unfamiliar dread, and he barely noticed how far into the forest he was going. It was as if the trees themselves were pulling him deeper, and the path seemed to twist and turn of its own accord. After what felt like hours, Daniel stumbled upon a clearing, a place he had never seen before. At its center was a small, abandoned cabin, the wood faded and broken with age, vines creeping up its sides like fingers trying to reclaim the structure, and there, standing silently by the cabin's rotting porch, was Valor. The stallion's coat was slick with sweat, his breathing ragged, but his eyes, those eyes, never wavered from Daniel's. A strange noise broke the silence then. A low growl, almost human in tone. From the shadows near the cabin, something moved. Something large, its form barely visible in the gloom, its presence unsettling. Daniel stepped backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his camera. The growl grew louder, and the shape in the shadows became clearer. A figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. The tension in the air was suffocating. The horse stood still, watching, as if waiting for something. The growl stopped. There was a long silence. And then the figure stepped into the light, revealing a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, wearing tattered clothes. Daniel's blood ran cold. He knew this man. It was Tom in the golden light of the afternoon. An odd stillness began to settle over the sanctuary. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the wind sighing through the trees, seemed to fade, leaving only an unsettling quiet. Valor stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Daniel shifted his weight uneasily, feeling an inexplicable tension in the air. The birds had gone silent, and even the soft crunch of his boots on the forest floor seemed muted, as though the world itself had become still, waiting for something. It was then that he noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The temperature seemed to drop, a coldness creeping in around the edges of the sanctuary. The trees, once swaying gently in the breeze, now stood rigid, their branches barely moving. It was as if the forest itself had held its breath. A noise broke the silence. The sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. Daniel spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. But when he looked, there was nothing there, just the thick trees and the deep shadows of the forest. He turned back to the horse, his instincts telling him to leave, but his curiosity rooted him to the spot. Valor was no longer standing still. He was moving, slowly at first, stepping cautiously toward Daniel. The horse's movements were deliberate, graceful, as if he knew exactly where to step to avoid the scattered twigs on the ground, as if he were leading Daniel somewhere, beckoning him to follow. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then, driven by a strange compulsion, began to walk alongside the horse. The air seemed even colder now, and the only sound was the rhythmic thud of Valor's hooves on the soft earth. The horse didn't make a sound, his breath visible in the cool air, swirling in the silence like a warning. They moved deeper into the forest, farther from the sanctuary, and Daniel's sense of unease grew. The dense trees closed in around them, and the path began to narrow, as if the forest itself was guiding them toward some unknown destination. The shadows stretched long and twisted, and the air became thick with an eerie, unnatural stillness. Suddenly, Valor stopped. The horse's head lifted, his ears pricked, and his eyes seemed to focus on something just beyond the trees, something Daniel could not see. The ground beneath them trembled, ever so slightly, and then Daniel heard it. Faint at first, but growing louder. A deep guttural rumbling, like the growl of some great beast, echoing through the trees. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was coming from the direction Valor was staring, but there was nothing visible, just shadows and more trees. The hairs on his arms stood up as the rumbling grew louder, and then, suddenly, it stopped. In the silence that followed, Valor began to move again, his pace quickening. Daniel had no choice but to follow, his mind racing as his legs struggled to keep up with the horse's long, purposeful strides. The rumbling sound had ceased, but the weight of something unspoken hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, they reached a clearing. The trees parted, revealing a small, shallow pond, its surface still and dark like a mirror. Valor stopped at the edge of the water, his eyes still fixed on the distance. Daniel caught up to him, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath shallow. Then, as if on cue, the quiet was shattered once again by a noise. A voice, soft but unmistakable. "Bailey, did you bring him here?" Daniel turned, his body stiff with shock. Behind him stood Agnes, her face pale and drawn. Her voice was low, as though she were speaking to herself, but it was clear she wasn't addressing him. "Why did you bring him here?" she repeated, stepping forward slowly, her eyes not meeting his. She was staring at the horse, her expression unreadable. There was something in her eyes, something dark and old, a hidden fear that had remained buried for years. The air around them seemed to pulse with tension, the silence hanging heavily between them. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, to ask what was happening, but no words came. It was as though the forest itself was forbidding him to ask. Agnes stepped closer to Valor, her gaze never leaving the horse. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained steady as she spoke, almost as if she were reciting an old, forgotten prayer. "Valor," she whispered. "He was never supposed to know." The stallion's head lifted slightly, and for the first time, Daniel noticed the faint glimmer of something in his eyes, something that was not entirely equine. It was as though the horse was aware of everything, of every secret hidden in this place, and that it had always known. Agnes knelt beside the pond, her hands brushing the water's surface gently, almost reverently. As she did, the reflection in the water shifted, distorted but undeniably there. Daniel could see the shape of a figure, a person standing just beyond the clearing, their face obscured by the shadows of the trees. The figure was not moving, but the tension in the air thickened as if the presence of the figure was the very thing that had caused the unease in the forest. For a moment, everything stood still. Valor, Agnes, the trees, the clearing, and Daniel himself, caught in an unspoken understanding that was only just beginning to reveal itself. The horse had known. Valor had known all along. Agnes slowly stood, her gaze still locked on the water. She took a deep breath, then turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed older than time. "Knew," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "Valor knew the truth long before we did. He knew the forest, the land, the secrets we tried to bury." The ground beneath them trembled again, stronger this time. The rumbling from before returned, louder and more insistent, as if the earth itself was awakening, calling them back to a truth long forgotten. Daniel's heart raced, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had just witnessed. Valor had led him here for a reason, but what that reason was, what the truth was, remained just beyond his grasp. As the rumbling grew louder, Valor turned and began to walk back toward the sanctuary, his head held high, his steps sure and steady. Agnes followed, her eyes never leaving the stallion. Daniel stood in the clearing, alone for a moment, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The forest whispered around him, the trees swaying in the wind, and the distant rumbling seemed to call him back. But it was too late. The truth had already been revealed, and with it, the forest held its breath once again. Daniel stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of Agnes's words reverberated in his mind. Valor had known. The horse, the land, the forest itself had always known something that Daniel couldn't yet grasp. What truth had been buried here, in the shadows of this sanctuary, in the depths of the ancient trees? The rumbling sound began to fade, the earth's trembling subsiding as quickly as it had come. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just been set into motion. There was a connection between the horse, the land, and something far older than he could understand. As if to break the spell, Daniel took a hesitant step toward the edge of the pond, his reflection merging with the dark, still water. The figure he had seen earlier, was it an illusion, a trick of the light, or something far more unsettling? His pulse quickened, but he couldn't quite bring himself to turn and look behind him. Instead, his gaze fell on the water. The surface had calmed now, and what had once been a shifting reflection was now crystal clear. For a brief moment, Daniel thought he saw something. Someone. In the water. A flash of an old face, a fleeting presence that seemed to blink out of existence as quickly as it appeared. He blinked hard and turned away, his instincts pushing him forward, but his feet felt heavy, reluctant to move. The air, thick with tension, seemed to hold him in place. Behind him, the sound of hooves drew closer, and when Daniel finally turned, he saw Agnes and Valor returning from the clearing. The stallion's powerful form moved with quiet precision, his eyes meeting Daniel's once again, those knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through him, to everything he had yet to comprehend. Agnes stopped a few steps away from Daniel, her face lined with exhaustion, but also something else. Something that might have been acceptance, or perhaps regret. "It's not just the land, you see," Agnes said softly, as though speaking to herself more than to Daniel. "It's the forest, the animals, the souls that walk here. They know the truth of this place, and they know that the story, it's not over yet." Daniel took a step forward, his breath shallow, struggling to keep his composure in the presence of something much larger than he could explain. "The truth about what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile thread of understanding that hung in the air. Agnes met his gaze, her eyes distant but full of sorrow. "The truth of the horse, of Valor, the truth of what he was meant to protect. This sanctuary isn't just a home for animals, Daniel. It's a place where a deep ancient pact was forged, one that should have remained forgotten. But now that you've seen it, now that you've followed him, the forest will not allow it to stay buried." The last words lingered in the air, heavy and foreboding. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches, sending a shiver down Daniel's spine. For the first time, he realized the entire sanctuary, the forest, the pond. It wasn't just a place to observe nature. It was a living, breathing entity, and it held secrets far beyond human understanding. A sudden rustling from the edge of the clearing snapped Daniel's attention away from Agnes. In the distance, deep within the trees, there was movement. Something large, something fast, heading their way. Valor's ears flicked back, and the stallion took a step forward, his stance tense and alert. Agnes, too, straightened, her eyes narrowing. She seemed to be listening to the same sound that had filled the forest just moments earlier. The rumbling, low and unyielding, as if the earth itself was warning them. Then, from the dense underbrush, a figure emerged. At first, Daniel thought it was another person, someone from the sanctuary, but as the figure stepped closer, the truth became unmistakable. It was an animal, a wolf, its fur dark as night, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hue. It moved with the grace of a predator, but its gait was deliberate, almost as though it were walking with. The wolf stopped just beyond the clearing, its eyes never leaving Daniel and Agnes. Valor snorted, pawing the ground in warning, but the wolf remained still, unyielding. Agnes stepped forward, her voice steady. "It's time, Daniel," she said quietly. "It's time for you to know why Valor brought you here." Before Daniel could speak, the wolf gave a low, resonant growl, sending a chill through the air. It was a warning. The ground beneath them trembled once more, this time with an intensity that seemed to shake the very trees. The rumbling rose again, but now it was joined by a deeper, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The wolf's eyes flickered to Valor, and for a moment there was an unspoken communication between them. Something ancient, something profound. Agnes stepped forward, placing a hand on Valor's mane. Her voice trembled, but it held an edge of finality. Valor was chosen, Daniel, chosen by the forest itself. He is the guardian, the keeper of the pact that binds the creatures of this land. And now, that pact is at risk.